Eric asked me to start a series of conversations here at the school, and wherever you are, Eric. Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I just said no introductions necessary, first names now. Anyway, I just wanted to thank Eric in absentia for essentially giving me a kind of carte blanche, who do you want to talk to and what do you want to talk to them about? Very, very nice open invitation. And as I was thinking about it, I decided that I would try to operate in the spirit of this essay that Reyner Banham published in 1960 called Stock Taking. And in this essay, he was addressing what he considered to be a pivotal realignment, if you look at the bold words, a pivotal realignment between what is, what could be, and what was. Now, the terms that define this juncture between past, present, and future for him were limited. They were almost reassuringly limited. Technology was what could be, tradition was what was, and he used these two straw terms to assert with incredible confidence what he thought ought to constitute the stock, the currency of architecture in the present, or that what is, so to speak. And I was thinking about this notion of stock taking, and after what's happened in the last couple of years, I don't think that we want to take stocks anywhere. Stocks are not the measure of value in the present, but today stocks are junk bonds, hedge funds, and automatically traded futures, which is to say that we no longer think of technology as true and tradition as made up, nor do we think of the two as opposed. Instead, I think we understand technology as having its own traditions, just as we understand tradition as being kept alive by a whole series of technologies. So as a result, and maybe most importantly, we are less certain about what should constitute the privileged terms of the present and consider the concept of today more a question than a fact. Now, Banham's confidence in the terms of stock taking actually derived, this confidence, this sort of hubris, actually derived from a kind of anxiety, which is to say that he felt that architecture was in a state of crisis. And I think that that's really the biggest difference between 1960 and Banham's view and my view of today, which is that rather than be in a state of crisis, I think we're in a kind of opposite state, a state of enormous success. And success, let's say, has its own risks. So in the spirit of be careful what you wish for, I will take up this series of conversations with people who are not only successful themselves, but whose work indicates in broader terms various forms of disciplinary, institutional, and professional success. So we might track the success in a variety of ways. If you think of the early work of Diller and Scofidio that really didn't look much like buildings, had a kind of alien, small scale, almost tragic quality in its initial inability to enter the field. An early architect who was a woman, who was really not recognized as such. Now I think that they basically can't lose a competition that they enter. Their projects are bigger and winninger than anybody. And even what was at one point a kind of risque thing for Diller and Scofidio, which was when they won the MacArthur Award, which was called the Genius Award. They were the first architects to win it. And the criteria, they were not considered the first geniuses, but rather the idea then was that professional practice had its own financial resources. And so the only people who needed grant money were people outside of the profession. So success in the MacArthur in those days was a sign of total failure in the world of professional practice. And now today we have like this. Somebody, well, who's not a genius, let's say. But who wins? It's a different kind of success. Another kind of symptom of success, I would say, we were just talking about why you can't let the videos go on forever and ever and ever without editing. It's because you say obnoxious things about people that you shouldn't. Another sign of architecture's success is the tremendous, and so let me just say, these people that I'm indicating are the people that I'm going to be speaking to over the course of the next few weeks. So Liz Diller will be one. Another is the German photographer Thomas Demand. And again, Thomas is not only a very successful artist in his own right, but the nature of his success has something to do with signaling the broader and growing cultural importance of architecture to political discourse, to media theory, to art collecting, et cetera, et cetera. He is not only a kind of incredible model maker, if you will, as an architect, but he's also become an architectural scholar. He spent a year in residence at the Getty. He's been in residence as a Mellon Scholar at the CCA, studying things like the cardboard models of John Lautner. So what you're looking at here is a photograph of a paper copy of a cardboard model by Thomas Demand in the guise of John Lautner. So we'll have that conversation. Museums now increasingly all over the world provide new and robust homes for architectural, not only collecting, but architectural production. They are the expanded field. They are the expanded field. They're expanding all over the world. Architects now produce this field. This is a project at the Maxi. Architects themselves, now this is Pippo Jorah, who will be one of the other people that we speak to, is now part of the team that is essentially propagating not just opium poppies at Maxi, but also things like PS1 pavilions that are now moving sort of everywhere. And the final conversation that will be with, I don't know, is it fair to say that that tie ought to just alone signal failure of a very profound sort? Maybe it's the hairdos across the board. And, it's almost mind-boggling to think that that has become that. Okay, so what was once unthinkable has entered into the very logic of architecture, and therefore it is our success that I hope to take stock of over the course of these 5 discussions with architectural figures, each of great distinction and success. It couldn't be more appropriate to begin this series with Beatriz Colomina, who simply as a sign of her success, he flew in yesterday, gave a lecture at UCLA last night, got rushed down here to do this afternoon, is rushing over to the A&D museum later, a kind of jam-packed schedule for which I'm really grateful that she took this time out of a busy day. But I think the point is that these 2 days are not an exception in her life. This is the way her life unfolds, and each one of these things is a different piece of work, et cetera. Anyway, the signs of Beatriz's success include an extraordinary series of important books, from Privacy and Publicity to Sexuality in Space, and more recently, Clip, Stamp, Fold. Her active work as a curator. I'll do it backwards. This is a show that she recently curated with a group of students, which she's presented last night. Her work as a director of the PhD program at Princeton School of Architecture. And if you take them all together, it constitutes a particular kind of success of giving the history of architecture a new form of importance, a new cadence, if you will. Now, insofar as Banham felt he was facing a crisis, the crisis, if you see, was caused, in his view, by a new attachment to architectural history and to architectural historians, particularly in the United States. He saw in the developing influence already in 1960 of Vincent Scully, he singles out Vincent Scully, a looming what we would now call postmodern turn away from the progressivist principles of the modern movement. Banham, in other words, saw history as in the way of the present, which is why it seems apt to begin these conversations with with Beatriz, and to try to take stock of the fact that she and others now use history to build a new version of architecture. She has built a body of work, a program, a discourse around architecture and mass media, and has argued very explicitly that each of these buildings are acts of architectural design. So the stock I would like to discuss with her today concerns her view of the current relationship between what is, what could, and what was to be, or rather, how do we think art history as architecture today? So speaking of history, I actually know very little about your, until we intersected in New York, I don't know very much about your own intellectual history. So maybe you would tell us.
My intellectual history, well, okay, I mean, hi, it was really nice to be here. This is a fantastic place. Last time I was in SCI-Arc, it was in Venice. This is an incredible building, and I'm also very excited to be here because I keep hearing how this school keeps getting better and better. So I was very curious about the atmosphere here. And the moment I walk into the building, I have this sensation that really the energy here is really very, very good, very positive. So, my own history, I studied architecture in Barcelona, and it became clear almost immediately to me that I was drawn into history and theory, into discourse. You have to take into account the time. This is the last years of Franco. The school was very, very politicized. There were protests everywhere. We spent most of our time in demonstrations and all kinds of political activism, basically. And the design at that point was seen as decadent. You know, all these people doing, you know, so the energy was not at that point in Barcelona, at least, in experiments in design. There was not such experiment. The experimentation was happening in the world of history and theory. So very much influenced by the School of Venice, by Tafuri and all the group around him, and to a certain degree also by Foucault and the whole French thought. There was a very, very strong history theory group, which include people like Ignacio Solá Morales, that then came to the United States. So Pep Ketglas, Jose Ketglas, who was a professor in the history and theory department. So I was immediately drawn to this department. Department in Barcelona doesn't mean the same thing as a department here. It means that area of studies, I suppose. And I start translating for them. For example, I translated 2 texts of Tafuri from the Italian into English when I was still a student. Social Democracy and the City in the Republic of Weimar, and what is the other one? Austro-Marxismo and the City. Two very important texts of Tafuri at that time. So this was my formative period in Barcelona. I was already working in the Department of History and Theory while studying architecture. Of course, in Spain, it's not that you can graduate as in Venice you could at that time as a historian. You have to do still everything, the project, calculate the structure. So it's different than in the United States because the schools in Spain also give you the license to practice. So you have to calculate everything, even including the air condition for your final thesis. And that allows you to practice. So while I was doing all of this, I had kind of, this was my soft spot, the things that I was doing on the side. And immediately after I graduated, there was a position, a full-time position in the History and Theory department. They say to me, apply, and I say, well, how can I apply? Tons of more qualified people will get it, but I did apply and I got it. And so that's what happened. I started a series of years in which I was actually 22, and I was already teaching full-time in Barcelona. And teaching in Barcelona was 600 students, a big kind of platform and a microphone. Right? So it was a completely different thing than the United States. At a certain point, the question of the PhD became relevant in Spain as it became in the United States. The first PhD programs in architecture are from the 70s. And so they were in Barcelona, and a number of people, including Solà Morales and Moneo, start teaching in the evening classes for the people that wanted to do the PhD, and I enrolled on those classes along with many of my friends. And then I thought to myself, the only way you can do a PhD is actually living. So I applied for a grant. It's kind of a funny story. I had come it's more complicated, the story. I had come the summer before for the first time to New York. And I was, for some reason, in the friend of a friend apartment that happened to be in Washington Mews in New York, really in the center of it all. And a professor of mine in Barcelona have told me, if you are in New York, you should go and see Richard Sennett. And I thought to myself, yeah, right. Like I could call Richard Sennett and say, you know, here I am, and he said, you know, I put it away, right? But then I'm looking down into this beautiful muse, and this friend of the friend says to me, I am saying to see this must be really unusual in New York, these little houses here, and he say, yeah, and you know who lives across the street? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, Richard Sennett. So then I took it as a sign, you know, because in fact, I think our life in retrospective is a little bit of that. You have to kind of understand when there is a sign, right? And so the sign was, this is the second time that you hear this name, right? Of all the people in New York, this is the second time Richard Sennett had been, you know, from two different people. So I decided to cross the street and say hello to him, who immediately invited me to have a coffee, and I don't know. And before I know, he makes me, he asked me to be a fellow at the institute. That if I came, I said I was so interested in New York, maybe I would ask for a grant. And he said, if you come, I make you a fellow at the New Institute for the New York Institute for the Humanities. Now, you know, I had no idea what that place was, but I thought to myself, why not? So I go back to Barcelona. I asked for the grant, and they give me the grant. And this is the middle of the summer. I come back to New York and realize the New York Institute for the Humanities is like this very small group of extremely qualified people, including Susan Sontag, who has just written the little book on illness as metaphor, Wolfgang Siebelsbusch, who had just written or was writing the railway journey, Tony Bidler was around. I mean, there were all these amazing, and Richard, of course, and a number of amazing people there. And there was nobody my age, nobody in their 20s. You know, that was a crazy thing, right, for him to have invited me as a young fellow. And that changed my mind. That is my intellectual history. Because for the first time, I saw how people like Susan Sontag could write this story of, or this account, actually, which is very personal, of illness as metaphor. At a certain point, it's personal, but the writing is not personal, in which all the research that he had done into the history of the disease, into the history of what the ideas that we have of illness and the way we use as metaphor, it was so beautifully written. I was so taken by that book. And then I asked myself the question, why is this not happening in the world of architecture? Why is what we read in architecture so dense, so difficult, so boring?
Well, so who was born? I mean, just let's take it one step back, perhaps. I mean, you didn't fall in the lap of Tafuri. You had to go to Venice. You had to leave Barcelona to go to Venice. No?
Yes. Barcelona was very much influenced by Venice. I never was a student of Venice, but you may know that Tafuri used to teach every 2 weeks. So it was possible from Barcelona, which, okay, it's 1,400 kilometers away, but it's possible to attend. It was possible to attend the lectures of Tafuri. That will be one day and the next day, and remain in Barcelona. And that I did sometime. And it was fascinating. I was fascinated by Tafuri, but there was something in the United States, in the way these people were writing, in the way Karl Sosky, Susan Sontag, or particularly Susan Sontag and Wolfgang Siebelsbusch were writing, that completely blew my mind away. You know, that was a different way of in which the writing itself.
And you would contrast it with Tafuri in particular? I mean, is Tafuri in your mind when you say boring and difficult?
But Tafuri was difficult indeed, not boring, but hard. But no, I wasn't thinking about him. I considered him really a very strong influence in my work as well. But there was something that was extraordinary about the work of these writers that did not exist in the world of architecture, right? So my ambition at that time was to write a history of modern architecture from the point of view of the illness, or the way in which the illness of the 20th century influenced the history of architecture, right? For example, and very particularly still an obsession, because it was an obsession because in the end I was not allowed to do this as a dissertation. I was told, oh, this sounds very good for a department of literature. Nobody could do that in architecture. So, you know, it's like the return of the repressed. You say no, I end up doing this laws, Le Corbusier, that end up being privacy and publicity. So it didn't work out bad, but this idea is still in my head, you know, the enormous influence that tuberculosis, which was really the obsession of the early part of the 20th century, had on the development of modern architecture. How we have studied modern architecture from every single possible point of view, technical, aesthetic, I don't know what, functional, you know, even contributions that I have myself done, like from the point of view of gender and sexuality and all these questions, post-colonial studies. I don't know, we have studied from every single point of view, but perhaps what we hadn't seen yet was what is most obvious, what is most on our face, the fact that that generation was completely traumatized by this illness, and that modern architecture, if you compare it to the medical treatises on the disease at that time, is like precisely a prescription for health. So what architects were advising and doing, you know, ventilation, air, terrace, exercise, white walls, etc., is exactly what a medical manual on the disease was recommended. So our architects, which in the end is always a kind of an opportunistic profession, I think, but no, I'm not saying that in a negative way, but it responds to a need, captures that need and responds to it. And it's not surprising, because there had been tons of studies of the impact of literature, of tuberculosis on literature, or even, I don't know, music, but how we can have never done this study. So this is a very long way to answer this question of
I want to still go back a little bit.
History,
we're getting into the details of the history.
But that's, I think, where I will say I was born as an intellectual there.
Well, there are two pieces of it that interest me for a moment as we sort of move on. One of them is to dwell a tiny bit more on the decision to not pursue a professional practice career, and the decision not only not to do that, but to do a formal PhD.
Yes.
Because presumably there's room, or there has been room in between of doing some other alternative form of practice. But that's not what you chose. So I'm curious about how you, was that an instantaneous?
No.
When you think of books being produced, I don't know, Complexity and Contradiction or Delirious New York, et cetera, books like that were influential, not part of a professional practice exactly, but also not part of a professional degree program. So I'm just curious about, did you consider anything else, or did you know it was specifically going to be a PhD? And what did a PhD in Europe exactly mean in those days?
Right. No, first of all, it was not immediate at all. I started actually studying architecture. I always talk about Barcelona, but in fact, I started in Valencia. In Valencia, the engineers and the architects start at the same time. When I chose to go into architecture rather than engineer, that was the first trauma, because my professors in engineering thought that was a waste of my talent, right?
To go into...
Yeah, why would you go into this kind of crazy kind of profession? So that was the first time that...
wasn't your father an architect?
My father was an architect,
okay,
yeah.
So just
right.
traumas that are being, you know...
Right. I mean, actually, I could go back even more years, and it's even, I mean, this is kind of a psychoanalysis. I have no idea that Sylvia was going to ask me. I had no idea what I came to do here, but it's becoming a kind of psychoanalysis.
Stream of
now
consciousness.
Even my father is now into the room. I mean, what? No, but I mean, it's kind of curious because if you go back even in Spain around when you are 13 or something, you have to decide between science and the humanities, basically. And at that point, I mean, all my life, I remember my sisters playing with dolls, and I remember reading. All I wanted to do is read, and I got lost in, and I thought I wanted to be a writer. I said, no, you're too good in, I was too good in science and in math. So again in the school they say, no, it's a waste of your talents. You can always go into science. You can read anytime you want. That's easy, So like a complete kind of. Anyway, so I went into the science, and then, I mean, I guess I will, I would have liked to study something else too. I probably would have studied medicine. That was something that I wanted, but. In my family, we were all women until my brother came way down the line, one of the last, and in fact, my father always, I'm the second, and my father always kind of.
You were the son.
I was the son. I was the son.
And therefore, you had to be an
engineer. Because I was very good in school, and so I thought I would know an engineer, an architect.
Oh, so you're the son, you're carrying on the family
Yes,
name.
and also, like when I was a child, I was the only one that always kind of volunteered. There are all these jobs that when you're an architect, your father or your parent, you have to go and visit the kind of the construction. So all my childhood is like going around to a village around in Valencia to see the construction of something and see how things is put together, but this is like from the age of, 5, And so everybody started to say I was going to be an architect, but I was not doing that because I wanted to be an architect. I was doing that for the pleasure of going by car in some sort of an excursion for the kind of cakes that the wife of the contractor or the guy that was in the side will give us after the thing for the little things that the only moments in your when you are part of a big family in which you are treated as an individual is when you are alone, and the others didn't want to come. My older sister got dizzy in cars. She didn't want to come. The others were too small or they were not interested. So I was always the one going, right? So everybody starts saying. So I felt like this pressure of my family to become an architect, which I did actually.
But then you said no.
Well, at a certain point when I went to Barcelona, just it's a way for me to differentiate myself.
Yeah.
My father was well known in Valencia. He in fact was the director, the equivalent of the dean of the School of Architecture in Valencia. Not the one, not when I was there, but after. So it was very good for me to disappear.
So then you decided not to be an engineer. So somehow you decided not to be a boy, and you decided not to be an engineer and not to be an architect.
Right.
And then you decided to get the first thing that you then decided was a PhD.
Right. Well, I didn't decide the PhD. I was so by chance.
We're talking to one of the only important schools of architecture in the world that does not have a PhD program, and it does not have lots of studios taught by people who have PhDs. This is like a PhD light part of the world, and it's a PhD light kind of institution. Right. Half of the PhDs in the front row are, another family, several of my students there, et cetera. But at any rate, the point is that there is something at stake in the PhD, and there's also something at stake in the PhD in coming to the United States to get a PhD. And I'm just curious about how that happened and what you thought that meant. And then my last question, if you don't like that one, because you can skip it if it's too personal, is the issue of writing. Yeah. Because you said you wanted to write like Susan Sontag, and that also means to engage the world in a particular kind of way. And does Susan Sontag have a PhD?
No, I don't know. I don't think that she has a PhD. I don't think that architects need to have a PhD at all to write. I think one of the most misunderstood aspects of the of architecture is the fact that writing is from the beginning part of the profession of the architect. You cannot think about architecture without thinking about writing, from Vitruvius all the way to the treatises of the Renaissance, Alberti, blah, blah, blah. You know, all of them wrote, and in fact, if you want to make the story short and limit yourself to the 20th century, there is practically not an architect in the 20th century that we consider, that we think about, that didn't write, and didn't write from the beginning, from Frank Lloyd Wright to Adolf Loos, to Gropius, to Le Corbusier, to Mies, even Mies, that people don't think that he wrote too much. There's an entire book of his writings. All of them wrote. And if they didn't write, we are not so interested in them. That's there may be a couple of exceptions, but this is a very important fact, because it doesn't end up with that generation. Of course, it goes then right into the middle generation with people like Allison and Peter Smithson, or the whole Team 10 generation in the United States or in Europe. You have in the United States people like Venturi and Scott Brown. You have Rem Koolhaas, you have Peter Eisman, you have all that generation, and it continues right into the end of the 20th century with young architects like Greg Lynn or Alejandro Zaera Polo, etc., who always wrote. And in fact, it's a known fact also that most of the time the writing precedes the work, right? So Rem Koolhaas, for example, to talk about someone that is obvious, is well known for Delirious New York, perhaps 10 or 15 years before he built anything that we could start kind of discussing, right? So for a long time, right, we know someone is famous all over the world as an architect, mostly for the books. Likewise, you can say about Frank Lloyd Wright, about Adolf Loos, etc. The writings precede the work. The writings are not about the work and precede the work, right?
So, but let's play devil's advocate for a moment, getting out of the cycle of my historical narrative here. I'm going to jump to the present. So let's say that this writerly tradition is one of the forms of success that we could, the books that you're talking about, they have become, per architect, more numerous. They have become bigger.
Yes.
They have produced more organs for publishing. There are more and more people who make books in architecture today than there used to be. So let's say that that's a sign of success. If you start looking at the books, the number that are like Alejandro's, that are texts written by the architect, constitute actually a fairly small percentage of the product that goes through that distribution system. And what you have now is endless series of monographs with essentially professional writers hired to do introductions. Mass numbers. If you were to quantify the writerly output produced by this great tradition of writing in the 20th century, you would end up with something that really doesn't much look like the tradition that you're talking about.
Right. Something has changed in more recent years, and I think that's a loss. I mean, I'm not counting those books as something significant in the practice of an architect. I'm talking about architects really thinking, what is the question, and trying to put it down in their writings, however disconnected they may be, right? I mean, there are famous stories about how the editor of MoMA had to kind of work so hard to put complexity and contradiction into some kind of readable form, right? I mean, you can look at the way architects write. It's not necessary that it's the best prose. That's not necessary. What is necessary is the effort to try to put down in this medium, in the medium of writing, what is the problem of our time. I think that's fundamental in the practice of an architect. The books that you are talking about, in which the professionalization of the PR person in the office and the person writing a book for the architect, I think that's kind of that's the end of the book, I will say. That's the end of the architect's book, and in fact, it's not an accident that I stopped with Delirious New York. I haven't said, I mentioned Greg Lynn, a couple of more, but I mean the classics are still there. It's like it's hard now to think about what has happened. I mean, yes, there are a couple of them, right, in beginnings of the 21st century, but there is more the kind of books that you are talking about. I don't have much regard for those books.
Well, so let's hold them, because I think ignoring them, let's say, may be something that we collectively do at our own peril. I mean, because they do constitute, you know, if we look at simply the question of quantity, they are the bulk of the product of architectural publishing.
Is anybody reading them?
I hope not,
right.
but that doesn't mean that they're totally inconsequential either. I mean,
right.
You've got to say, I would imagine that you would be the first to acknowledge that the things that are perceived in their own time as being the most inconsequential are very often the things that ultimately turn out to bite you in the ass. So if we've got a field that is now producing book after book after book after book after book after book after book, there's got to be some relation between the history of the book that you're describing and the construction of this edifice of books on the other hand, and that seems to me to be exactly the question. I mean, I'm not making a cause and effect, but it just seems to me
But the books that I have mentioned are books that change the course of architecture. I mean, Le Corbusier's in architecture changed the course of architecture. There are books that were read and published in many languages that generated a whole debate about what are we supposed to be doing now. Same thing with complexity and contradiction. Complexity and contradiction changed the course of architecture. These books that you are talking about, that I know have not changed any course so far. But I'm very, very curious about what is happening, on the other hand, in another media. And that's what I think maybe we are not able to see yet. Because, of course, this generation, the generation that I was talking about now, is the generation of the book. Printed media was the dominant media in the 20th century. But in the last couple of decades, a kind of unbelievable, unforeseen revolution has taken place, in which, you know, you have the internet, Google, YouTube, Twitter, I don't know what, Facebook, social media has profoundly changed the way in which we relate to each other. We do research, we write, even we make love. I mean, how can we expect architecture not to be affected? So I will say that what a later generation may be looking back into this one and trying to see where it may be in this new media, and this proliferation of books in the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, maybe like the last kind of diarrhea of the century.
The question is, which maybe we'll come back to this at the end, the question is whether it's the last trace of the end of the culture of the book, or whether the book, those kinds of books, are anticipating the next form of the shaping of architectural discourse, in which exactly in the sense that you're talking about, people will have multiple platforms. They won't be edited. They won't be peer-reviewed. They won't be, they're self-produced. They'll be split authors. It'll be much more complicated.
Yes.
So I think,
and they will be shorter too.
yeah. Okay. But so speaking of all of these,
not fat books, but little kind of. I mean, I don't know. I try to imagine what this generation will end up doing, what media they will use to kind of articulate the first kind of thoughts about what is it to be done, because I think this is a very important exercise, the most important exercise in a thesis is always to formulate the question, right? What's the question? There is a very beautiful anecdote of Gertrude Stein, in which she is in a very difficult operation. She's very ill. She didn't die in that operation, but everybody thought she was going to die. And now she's kind of being wheeled into the operating room, and she's lying down there, and she kind of counts vertical, and she says, "What's the answer?" And then she goes back, and everybody thinks that those are her last words. And then she goes up again and says, "But what is the question?" Right? So the question is so important in the articulation of what a thesis is going to be, as it is in what a problem of architecture is?
Well,
What is the question, right?
okay, so last night Beatriz and I were having a conversation about renderings. Some of you have heard me go on about the rendering, the problem of the rendering in the contemporary. We were talking specifically about the role of rendering in Playboy magazine, and we didn't quite have enough time to bring it into the question of contemporary rendering and so forth. I would just submit for a later discussion that the contemporary publishing is the same as contemporary rendering, and it's one platform across many, one shaping of the way the field is produced, and whether or not the architect is the one who writes it, pens it, renders it, et cetera, is precisely not at all the point. And these things are proliferating across a series of platforms. I'm not sure that I think that they will get shorter, but they'll definitely get thinner, but there will be more of them, right? So when you start thinking about how does architecture produce discourse, it'll be across a wider range of things. But in any case,
but if I can add one thing there, I think that this is correct, and that the practice of architecture involves many media, but not now. It has always involved many media, of which the written word is the one that usually students have more difficulty in understanding that that's part of the practice of the architect. So you have the written word, renderings or drawings. I mean, the invention of perspective, the invention of all the new forms of representation is completely linked to the schools of architecture, models, etc. So all this, and of course then films and whatever, you know, with every new media, new forms of representations are being. So basically, architects have always been like multimedia artists, right? And the important thing to remember, if we keep going back to the question of history and the PhD, is that architects do not need a PhD, but need to remember that writing is part of the story.
So, okay, so on writing, I guess, you know, we can just, I can't quite let this go. I guess my point, I'm not making my point clear, was not about the multimedia nature of things, because that's for sure a long historical thing, but rather that it's going to become increasingly less important who does the producing. That's what I meant by the renderer. Right. We generally don't hold an architect accountable to produce his own rendering. We are very easily forgiving of whoever it is that sends off building XYZ to China to a big rendering farm. We look at Playboy and we make a distinction between the architect and the renderer. We think of Peter Eisenman making jokes about, you know, an architect is somebody who draws, and then going, well, look at Bob Stern. Because apparently Bob Stern is not an architect because he can't draw, rather than trying to think about the managerial aspect. You know, so if you then begin to think that the contemporary architect is not a multimedia artist, but rather a manager of multiple mediums, and writing could be one of them. They could hire a ghost writer, they could hire a ghost renderer. I mean, I think that that's a slightly different notion than needing to be accountable to the craft of writing. But maybe let's get to that by going back now.
But
maybe,
I mean, can I go right in there? I mean, I think it's very important to understand that architects have always been a collaborative practice, and that the idea of the single architect is completely bankrupt, that nobody could sustain that illusion anymore. I mean, so like in film, there are a number of expertise that go into the practice of architecture, and of course you can send your renderings to be done in China, or have Hugh Ferris in the office in the 20s that will be doing the renderings of Manhattan. It's not new. There has always been this situation. What I was trying to talk about is not so much these renderings that are done for a particular situation. I'm talking more about the kind of the thinking of architecture.
Yes, and I'm just asking
what
form does thinking take today? Because all of the books that we're referring to are books produced by single figure author architects. And I'm looking out at colleagues, I'm looking at Hernan, for example. Hernan, how many conversations have we had about whether or not you, by you, I mean your generation, needs to produce a definitive, theoretical, discursive formation. We've had that conversation 1,000 times. We've come up with 1,000 names for this school. It's going to be this, it's going to be seductive, it's going to be, whatever it is. And in the end, it actually doesn't get produced exactly. And up until recently, I've been thinking of that as a kind of failure. Frankly, not personal to you, but rather that architecture comes into being by the production first of this discourse. And if you don't have it, you don't have the body of ideas articulated against which you can measure the ultimate experiments. And as I look around at the younger generations, they are not doing that. And I am wondering, are they not capable of doing that, which would be the depressing position, or rather, could there be a way, some notion that the conditions for that kind of thinking, and therefore the means of their articulation, whether they have changed, and whether our attachment to language and writing and so forth, whether we need to understand that in a different way. It's probably no different than you were saying we need to read Twitter, although I am incapable of reading Twitter. So I don't know how to read Twitter. I don't know how to do it. But anyway, but let me ask you another question, maybe that is still on this question of writing, but in a slightly different way. So today, given at least the way I've set this up, deliberately and maybe unfairly, I've sort of set you up to be a historian.
Okay.
Right? I mean that,
Right.
But in the 90s, you were a theorist.
Oh.
This is what people.
This is what you say.
This is not what I said. This is what people said. And you said to me last night, in the 90s, you had to go when you're first in the States, you had to go to all kinds of crazy places because theory, everybody wanted theory and nobody had theory. Memphis didn't have theory and Arkansas didn't have theory. And she was telling this extraordinary story about being a young Spanish woman recently arrived in New York, getting known as a theorist and having to have her first experience in God knows where in all 50 states to deliver theory.
Yeah, it was interesting because in fact the first places that asked me to lecture were the main places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Columbia, etc., and then came the rest of the, at the same time, right? So you end up in, I don't know, in Memphis or in Arkansas or I don't know, in Lexington, Kentucky. So I then have this incredible kind of idea of the United States from these trips in which I always will insist that they will take me to see something weird around, right? So it was a nice experiment. I don't identify myself with either a theorist or a historian. I don't consider myself a historian, and I don't consider myself a theorist. I consider myself, again, going back to the question, as an architect who writes. That is, we all have to understand also our limitations. I think is one of the most important things in life, to understand your limitations. I consider myself an architect who writes because that's the medium in which I operate, writing. And the fact that I did a PhD doesn't mean really that much, right? But instead, in the writings, the training of architecture for me is still very important. The structure of the piece is extremely important. Yes, people say she's a historian and theorist. They say both. But in fact, in the 90s, when we were part of that group of, young, new assemblers, rather, Michael Hayes or Mark Wigley or Jennifer Bloomer, Catherine Ingraham, or I was considered the historian among them. Why? Because I used to go to archives. Mark never went to an archive to do his books. Catherine will never go to an archive. Not even Michael Hayes will go to an archive. Right? Then there was the attacks against theory on that period. Every time you do something new, you should expect to be attacked in every direction. That's a sign of success, now that you are so interested in the question of success. It was also interesting that they didn't attack me so much as they attacked Michael Hayes as unreadable and incomprehensible or whatever, or they attacked Mark Wigley, or they attacked everybody, but almost nobody attacked what I was doing, right?
And do you think that had to do with the historical cover or the nature of the writing?
I have no idea. I really have no idea, you know. I mean, I remember going to there was that conference in the Chicago SOM that actually was the idea of Jeff Kipnis, that at a certain point realized that there was all these new young people doing work in new areas of, and there was this conference, I don't know what it was called, Strategies of Architectural Thinking or something in Chicago. And there were people like Winter and Wigley and Hayes and myself. I mean, all of the people I have named. And you know, I gave my paper, and Jeff, you know, we are kind of in line to have some sort of buffet lunch or something, and Jeff starts complimenting me on the piece and how well informed it is on the construction and I don't know what, and you know what, I turned to him, I said to him, well, that may be, but I haven't read Derrida, you know, because I haven't read, I mean, I haven't read it the way everybody else would have read it, but I haven't read it attentively. I have read attentively Benjamin, very attentively, but I never was very captured, you know, by Derrida. So at that point, Derrida had not been really an influence at all. Did you see Derrida this is the paper in Chicago, on the work of Adolf Loos and the interior and the gaze, and you see Derrida there? Everybody saw Derrida there. I said, what the hell are they talking about? Right? Well, I could see Foucault, but I couldn't see Derrida at all. So those things happen, they are part of the culture of the time, and you absorb it maybe through your skin or something, but not necessarily through serious, like Marr did his dissertation on Derrida. He was at Derridian.
You mentioned Sanford and Jeff.
Yes.
Who are not trained as architects.
Right, neither Catherine Ingraham, who was there too, right?
Yes, and so what how do you think that structures their strategies and thinking?
I think it was really interesting that moment when people, let's say outside architecture, came into the discourse. I don't know how they themselves think about their own position, but I think they fundamentally changed the way in which we discuss architecture at that point. And that was a new phenomenon, a relatively new phenomenon of so many people coming from other fields and engaging in the discussion of architecture, a positive thing, I would say, right?
Do you think it's possible for that to happen today?
Of course, it's still happening, isn't it? Kipnis coming around here, and Quinter teaching at Harvard, and
oh no! But those are my signs of success.
Ah.
I mean, in other words, those are all mavericks that now have
you mean they are
tenures and all that kind of stuff. I'm asking whether the incorporation of that kind of thing, whether the professionalization of writing, the proliferation of PhDs, I think more and more, I mean, we could ask everybody in the front row practically, why did you feel that you needed a PhD? Why couldn't you just go, just go do whatever it is that you were going to do?
I'm in the wrong crowd here.
Yeah, get out of the front row. You're screwing up my metaphors here. Yeah, you got to go sit in the architect's corner. We're going to make you a hat. We're going to give these guys a motorboard or whatever. The other ones can go have a pointy hat in the corner. But I just wonder of the various people that I think of as teaching around. I mean, I don't, of a younger generation of doing different kinds of things, and I mean, I'm just asking. I'm trying to think of somebody who has really entered the field recently with a bang, who doesn't come from an architecture background.
I don't know. I'm from an architectural background. John Harwood is from art history, right?
Well, that's like a twin.
Yeah, I know. It's like you, right? It's the twin, but still, it's
evil
not from
twin.
It's like the evil twin. I think that also is a good sign. It's a good sign when people from art history come into architecture, and they kind of engage in the discussion in a completely different way, I think. And it enriches the conversation, because in the end it's like the practice of architecture, the practice of so-called history and theory is also a collaboration, a conversation, let's say a conversation among colleagues that write this, and then you say that, and what, and somebody else say, oh, what they are saying is this and that. So this is exactly what it is. It's a conversation. Architecture is a conversation among different things, and so I think it's actually very well fitted to the reality of today and the new media and more forms of collaborative production, but less in the old sense that started in the end of the 80s that you were talking about. I remember when I was studying at Columbia University that started this phenomenon of architects that will pay out of the budget of their office their so-called books, and these books were monographs on the office that then they will give to their clients, but to ensure the success of it, they will go to Kenneth Frampton and ask him for an introduction. And he was writing, I don't know how many a week, these introductions, and he himself made a joke, or at least passed it on to me, as somebody had said to him, what is a rare book? Today, a rare book is one that doesn't have an introduction by Kenneth Frampton. So he himself was aware of the whole industry that he was creating, and that started a new thing. That is what you are talking about, farming out the writing, and so that doesn't produce very interesting books. But some form of collaborative kind of production, and the new platforms maybe make that possible. I am very interested in what could emerge out of that.
Well, I think I'm just trying, I'll say two things. Jeff said to me once, not all that long ago, that his nightmare was to wake up and discover that he had become Ken Frampton. So there's
no chance.
Well,
he's writing a lot of introductions.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I think that he's happy to do it up to a point, and I think that the model of Ken Frampton lurks around, and it's kind of scary. And I think that there was a sense, I would imagine, I'm speaking for Jeff, really never a good idea for many reasons, but I would have imagined that his outsider status was something that he thought over the long run was going to inoculate him and protect him from the fate of becoming Ken Frampton. And he has been, with great effort, absorbed by the field in such a way that maybe we all, I'm not speaking about him in particular, need a different form of inoculation, or we need to think about the introduction and the hiring of writers. We need to think about those forms of discourse in a slightly different way. Maybe we could talk about, we moved the sort of the last broad set of things that I wanted to talk about. We'd talk a little bit about history, a little bit about writing, about the other sort of buzzword that acts as a kind of virus going in between architecture as a professional practice and the sort of the intellectual branch of architecture, and that's this word research. So it seems to me that research is like a strange pop-up concept, maybe, that is occupied perhaps in different ways by scholars or writers or architects, and I don't know, what do you think of research today? Do you have any?
I mean, I think that the practice of architecture is impossible without research, right? I mean, research, any architectural firm qualified, any young architectural firm actually will talk about their practice as research, and many of these books are presented in that way, right? I mean, so research.
Just because they present it that way doesn't mean that we have to agree that it constitutes
No,
research. So I'm just asking, what is, what do you make of the cult, the contemporary cult of research? How do we think that it's being used? I mean, I guess you see in school after school, studios not being studios anymore. They're research, this and that. Programs are no longer design programs or doctoral programs or whatever. They're research programs. I mean, that's what. I'm just thinking, so research is normally, one way to think about research is the way a scientist would use the term, and there would be the scientific method, and there's observation and analysis and the distribution of data. I mean, is that research?
I don't know. I mean, what word do you use here in SCI-Arc? Experiments? I mean, if you look into the science, you can use the word research, but you can also use the word experiment. I mean, and I think maybe that's more appropriate to the practice of architecture, right? You make experiments, you kind of test ideas, right? But research is always part of it, no? When you start a project, don't you start thinking about, precisely because we are always looking into, even if it is research into material, even if it doesn't have to be research into precedents, it doesn't have to be research into the site and the conditions of the site and the history of the site, but all of that sometimes is part of the practice of the architect, but there are other kinds of research. Right?
Well, I guess
that is a precondition, I suppose. You have to know what is it that you are dealing with, right?
I guess I was thinking, could the metaphors of experiment, lab, C-lab, X-lab, Dooley lab, there are thousands of labs. So we have research, we have labs, we have experiments. I mean, there's a rhetoric that is too consistent to be accidental. So it just, again, if we take your position that you have to pay attention to the things that invisibly shape the conditions of what you're doing, it would seem to me that the research vocabulary, you think of this studio now no longer as a studio, but a lab where you make experiments of one sort or another. And
is that bad? I mean, you think that's bad? I mean, by the way, a studio is also being used constantly, right? The Studio X of Columbia University. Yeah. I mean, so all those lab, research, experiment studio are being used equally, no?
Do I think it's bad? Yeah, actually, I think it's a little bit bad. That's what, but that's that's kind of another matter. But I was thinking more before saying whether it was good or bad, just trying to figure out how it operates, what makes it possible to think about it in those terms. So just,
I think, I mean, if you think about institutionally, architecture have always had a hard time belonging, fitting in the university, right? They don't, still to this day, they don't know what to do with us, right? All the universities have this problem. You don't have that problem, which is a great advantage for SCI-Arc because you don't have to respond to any other big university with their ideas of what constitutes research. But any research university, and they are called that way not by chance, like exactly. Princeton, etc., they are constantly checking on what is happening in those in the schools, and they rather like the idea of research labs, experiments, etc., because that fits into what everybody else is doing, whether it's in the humanities or in the science. Where before it was like, what are these not people with the lights on the entire day in the School of Architecture doing over there exactly, right? I mean, this is because they don't like the idea that this is a professional school, and I don't like the idea too. I mean, the profession is something that you can learn when you get out of here and go and work for someone, right? I mean, I don't think the schools of architecture is the moment to learn about the profession, right? So, I mean, I think the experiments, think tanks, research labs. I mean, in many ways, the studio is almost like a think tank. You have a problem, and you have like 10, 12 people, and the studio teacher working in a way collaboratively. In this problem, then you invite a number of people that keep yada-yadding about your projects, but in a way that also is part of this think tank on a question. And if the studio teacher is sufficiently smart to put a question on the table that is of significance, then is also beneficial to their own practice as architects, right? I mean, a lot of architects use the studio as a way to think through problems in their practice, right? The problems that they are interested in.
I guess my own feeling is that I'm not so sure that research happens, and if it does happen, I'm not so sure it only happens in universities. I think that there would be some way of thinking about that more broadly, and I'm trying to think about, for example, in our field, is there a difference between applied and pure research? And it would seem to me, I mean, I'm just using the common cliches of the scientific method, and it seems to me that one of the things that's really at stake for a lot of architects today is precisely the difference between applied and pure research. And I think that the self-image of the field is that it has gone through a long stage of pure research and now needs to move into a space of application. And I think that this is troubling for architects, but I think scholars are doing applied research more and more. They just don't call it that. So if we think about the shape of the way you work and the way that it has changed from books that you write to collaborative projects, orchestrating groups of students, to work on thematics that you have set, to rapidly produce information that has broad dissemination, and that is disseminated not only in the book but through multiple platforms. So if you just take Playboy as an absolute example of that, there might be a way to describe that as applied research. Would you think of that as a positive or not?
You see, I consider Clip Stanford and Playboy and all these projects in which I have collaborated with the students to be rather a kind of pedagogical experiment, which doesn't mean that I don't keep writing my own books. Those keep being written, and they are written entirely by me. This was the idea precisely that the model of the individual scholar isolated, pale in their library was obsolete in our times, right? And that more interesting models of collaboration could be implemented. It was also the idea looking at what a PhD program is, that the PhD programs were established in the 70s. And the idea of the PhD programs in architecture was the idea that, you're going to hate that, but there were huge debates about it with Sybil Mulholland and Henry Millon and the Society of Architectural Historians, conference, etc., always talking about kind of the way in which the art historians have become absolutely, the students were bored, basically. They wouldn't
Why would I hate that?
I don't know, maybe you wouldn't like this idea, but they idea that the art historians was considered lacking by the schools of architecture, and they decided, okay, what we need is to establish PhD programs that educate already trained architects into the discipline so that they will teach the students. So the idea of the PhD programs is the idea of educating a service profession in the service of the other service profession, which is architecture. Well, many things have changed since the 70s, and you have now a situation in which it's hardly the case that people that finish their PhDs are going to be just teaching in a school of architecture. They do all kinds of different things. I have PhD students that in the middle of doing their PhD students, they win competitions. I mean, actually, Urthi just won a competition in Medellin, or they are nominated for the best architects under 40, the young architects, or win another competition here. Or so they are architects, they come to the PhD program after having practiced, and they may return to practice, or they may even win a competition, or they may become directors of a museum, or they may become deans. So the situation has changed radically. So this experiments started with this realization, and the question was how education has to change. So the idea was instead of having people working in isolation, to borrow something from the world of design, that I think there's a lot of intelligence in it, precisely the world of the studio, in which, as you know very well, you have a team of people working on a project to produce a project, right? But it's kind of collaborative because you are, so to adapt the model of the studio into the PhD program, that's the principle of these experiments. So it's very slow, it's not at all like the design, it's not rapidly produced at all. Clip Stanford took like 8 years to take off, at least. So several years of research, seminars, workshops, etc., for the research, and then mounting the exhibition, etc., the book, and the idea that architects in PhD program are different, I suppose, from students in the PhD program of an art history department. For example, for the most part have studied architecture. Their first love, for so to speak, is architecture. So to engage that part of their brain is incredibly important. Mounting an exhibition is a form of architecture for me. So to have students in the PhD program not only doing the research but also the design and including the mounting of the exhibition was a way of saying these two things are not that separate, right?
So if doing all of these things, doing a program, writing a book, doing an exhibition are all forms of architecture, yes, which is an argument, I'm going to refer now, let me just say, Beatriz has to get in a car very soon, so I'm going to just ask maybe one more question and then open it up to the audience. But I think that there are lots of questions we could have about what is the relationship between, say, PhD students to design students. We're talking to students who don't have any PhD students around them. Can a school be a significant school if it doesn't have a PhD program, for example? Those would all be questions that it would seem to me worth asking. How do you pick your topics? I mean, those would all be, the way you all talk about techniques of design, those would be techniques of the scholar, for example. But in any case, last night when presenting this work on, this super interesting work on Playboy, part of your conclusion was that the architectural effect, I suppose, of Playboy was to make modernism popular. Would that be fair? I think that's what you said.
I may have said something like that. I mean, I think it's incredibly interesting that Playboy may have played a more important role in the dissemination of modern architecture in this country than any other platform, including the Museum of Modern Art. And this is because, there have been quite a kind of resistance to the introduction of modern architecture in this country. As you know, it came very late in the international style, and it was always received with a lot of resistance. But it's super interesting that a magazine that had 7 million readers, 7 million subscriptions means like 20 million, maybe 28 million. I don't know how many millions read one particular magazine, but this is to a lot of people. We'll have things as Ant Farm or Chrysalis or the New Domestic Landscape in their pages. So from the very beginning of Playboy, you have Frank Lloyd Wright and Miss Van der Rohe move through the kind of 1950s crowd of Eames, Saarinen, Noyes, etc., and you end up with the most radical work of Ant Farm, Chrysalis, Futuro House, etc. The most radical experiments are presented in the pages of Playboy, and yet nobody had done a significant study of this. That was the impulse. And why did I go into this? Actually, almost by accident. Working on the Eames and Saarinen, I realized they were published in Playboy. Ant Farm came to give a talk in the school. I was to introduce him. He gives me the bibliography, and I noticed he was published in Playboy. The House of the Century was in Playboy. We are interviewing Hans Colijn for the Klippenstand 4, and he talks to me about how in Moscow things were so difficult at that time when he was interviewing Leonidov for an issue of Bau, and in the frontier they confiscated his Playboys, and I thought he was going to say they confiscated something, but his drawings or something like his Playboys, and I was like, what? You are what? Of course, that generation was profoundly affected by Playboy. So we as historians should look at Playboy, of course, to look at what happened there. And then when I started looking at it, I realized there was so much architecture, so much design in that magazine that it was astonishing, So.
If you haven't gone online to look at the Playboy exhibition, you should. You should hope it comes here because it's really pretty
Thank you.
Seductive. And do look at the pictures. Read the articles too, but for sure look at the pictures. We had an elaborate conversation last night about another history that one could now write, having been invited to look at Playboy from an architectural point of view, which would be the design of women's breasts, which you really don't realize has changed quite so much in such a short period of time, maybe more than architecture in some ways. But okay, so I can't help but point out it's almost like an itch that I can't scratch, is that you started off by saying in Barcelona that you were going to sort of leave architecture because architecture was considered very decadent, and then we end up now many years later in the Playboy pad with plush, everything in the very lap of decadence. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but it ought to mean something. But if you say that the effect of Playboy was to make modernism popular, what is the effect on architecture of doing scholarship on Playboy?
What is the effect on architecture to doing a scholarship on Playboy?
I mean, are you trying to make something popular? Trying to make Playboy popular, or?
No, I am trying to say in the diffusion of modern architecture, we have looked at everything. We have looked at what architects wrote about what they built. We have looked at architectural magazines. We have looked at what critics wrote about. We have done tons of studies on Banham. Banham, by the way, was very keen on Playboy. He wrote an article called "I Will Crawl a Mile" for Playboy, where he already in 1960 points out to the significance of Playboy for architecture, but obviously nobody pick it up as a possibility of research. There are many things that we neglect to study. I mean, actually, I don't see it very different than having looked at the Clip Stand Fall, which is all the radical magazines that were published in the 60s and 70s. Tons of study has been done on the magazines of the avant-garde, right? Exhibitions, books on L'Esprit Nouveau, on Mirth, on on all the little, and nobody in their right mind will not understand that the history of the avant-garde in architecture and in art is inseparable from the history of these publications. But what nobody had realized at the time with this research is that there was another wave of magazines in the 60s and 70s, which is of equal significance to that of the earlier period, that it was also driven by a profound transformation in the way in which we make things. So the invention, for example, of the Xerox machine was absolutely crucial. So instead of going to the hot print of the early magazines, etc., you could do things on your kitchen table, and that's how these magazines like Archigram were being done, and that's why there are so many student journals from the AA, etc. So that period of the 60s and 70s, that in that moment that we did this study was coming back. There were a lot of exhibitions of Archigram or the Metabolist or Kopf Himmelblau, etc., but nobody was looking at the magazines, which in my view were the real motor of that revolution in architecture. And I was actually super aware also that at the time that we were doing the study, a new form of media was becoming operational, right? And that probably, and that's why I keep going back to this, in the future we will look back to that generation of architects, and we'll see that maybe the printed media is not where it was at anymore.
So you start thinking of your questions, because I have one last one.
Okay.
So you used the word radical.
Yeah.
I think I've said that one. Are you laughing at me because I've said this is my last question like 15 times?
Yeah.
This is my penultimate question. I reserve the right to ask one more if I think of it.
Absolutely.
So you use the word radical.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine you use the word radical in opposition to some notion of decadence. I can't hear, let me finish. I can't hear radical outside of the context of the history of, say, the world of Tafuri and Italian architecture of that period. And I wonder whether you could articulate for us what it means to be radical today, and whether or not there is such a thing in your view as a radical architect who builds. Is that an oxymoron? Is that a conflict in terms? And if we were to look at your subjects of choice,
yeah,
and to extract from them a definition of radicality, or in other words, if you were to reverse my question and say, Beatriz only writes on things that she considers to be radical, So the definition of radical is to be found in the range of things that she writes about. And therefore, those things that she does not write about would by definition be not radical. You tend not to write, it's not a rule, you're hard to pin down, which is one of the pleasures in talking to Beatriz, but you don't write much about practicing architects.
All right, so many questions there. The radical that I was talking about is very specific in time. It's the 60s and 70s. Germano Celant coined the term radical design to refer to that generation of architects that we just mentioned, like Archigram, Super Studio, etc., etc. So when I talk about radical architectural magazines, I'm talking about a very specific, limited time. I don't write necessarily only about radical architects. I mean, unless you consider everybody I write about, from Adolf Loos to Le Corbusier, to Mies, to Kistler, to Molino, to I don't know what. I mean, you can talk about all these architects, Eames, etc. Are they all radical? I don't know that they are radical, you know. I mean, so it was very specifically used for this particular term. The word radical, of course, comes from root, so it has several possibilities. In this particular moment, it meant also radical politically. These magazines, many of these magazines were not only the magazines of the counterculture, but also magazines made by people that were politically active. There were a lot of things coming from Paris '68, a lot of things coming from Spain in the years of Franco. Latin America, very important in the little magazines. You cannot separate the situation in Mexico, for example, the revolts of the students, or in Valparaiso from this proliferation. So what is also extremely interesting about this moment is that for the first time also we are not talking only about Europe and the United States, but about a global phenomena. So when we start doing the little magazine, what was extraordinary is that you couldn't just do this as Europe versus the United States. We may have started there, but immediately realized that this was not possible without considering the enormous production in Latin America, in Japan, even in Australia, and New Zealand. So it was a global phenomenon. You say I don't write about contemporary architects. That is the case. Is an anecdote also I have from when I came to the United States. It was the same year that Enrique Miralles, who was a classmate of mine, and we were very close friends, and Carmen Pinos came to New York too. We came with the same grant. At the end of the, and also Ignacio Solá Morales, he had the same grant, but in a senior kind of thing. He was much older than us, of course, we were a professor. And at the end of the year, Enrique say, I'm going back to Barcelona. And I say, why are you going back to Barcelona? I say, what do you want me to do here? Work for Richard Meier? And I realized he was absolutely right? That as a young architect in New York at that time, your best chance will be to work for Richard Meier, right? I mean, our best friend, my best friend at that point, I have met Liz and we were becoming friends and all of that. I mean, Liz was doing installation work. Nobody, either you were doing this, Liz was an exception, people coming out of school and instead Enrique goes back to Barcelona and he immediately is giving the cemetery, the school in Igualada, I mean all this stuff. So you are 28 and you go back to Barcelona and nobody has a problem giving you an entire school, an entire cemetery, an entire stadium to build, right? In New York, forget it. I mean, you have had to be, like, I don't know what, 55, right? And so instead, I realized in the United States, the opposite was true for theory, right? In Spain, to be taken seriously, probably I would have had to be 50. And in New York, there was no problem. Immediately, I started publishing in Revision, in Assemblers, in other. So you had a voice in your 20s. Some people will take you seriously. So also, theory was developing in very different ways in the United States. One of the things that Ignacio told me before he left, because he also left after 1 year, she said, "You will be fine here." You know, it was like, okay, but never, ever write about a contemporary architect. And I say, why is that? And he says, if you do that, that will be the end. You know, the moment you start writing about and then the other one is upset about it. You know, it was not that so much what drove me not to write about it, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the architects I was working with, like Adolf Loos, like Le Corbusier, like Kisler, like all these guys, like Bucky Fuller, etc., had made this effort of writing, right? And I thought to myself, no, they should precisely. And also, I think the negative example of what we have talked about, of the kind of writing introductions and as if you were making, I don't know, sausages, also was, for my generation, a very, very strong negative influence. We did not want to be, and that's why Jeff still has this nightmare. We did not want to be Kenneth Frampton. We wanted to completely stop the tradition of the critic that kind of elevates the architect to another level, etc., etc. No, I want to enter a conversation with architects, and in fact, you would have seen that in El Croquis and in a number of magazines, I have had conversations, right? For example, El Croquis asked me to write about Frank Gehry, and I say, I'm not writing about Frank Gehry, but I will have a conversation with him. Or later, they came and say, will you write about Ren Koolhaas? I say, no, I will not write about Ren Koolhaas, but I will have a conversation with him, which meant that I did research, or I put some serious thought into what I thought Rem have done, and then went there with the intention to kind of tease out of him something that he would never have said on his own, right? And I think that is an interesting thing for us to do. The kind of exchange is more interesting. That is a document of our time, I think, to have a conversation with someone and to get something strong out of it. In fact, El Croquis had somebody else interview him, and Rem did this with the interview. And they were devastated because they actually was good. Or they thought it was good. And I asked them, why did you do that with this interview from these two guys from Spain that have done it? And he said, they didn't ask a single question that provoked me into giving a new thought. So they were all questions, right, in his opinion. So that's not the way to do an interview either, to look at other interviews or to try to get the same answer. He liked the interview we had because he was forced to think something else. He was put in a spot in which he was supposed to think something. I think that's very productive. I don't think that architects need me to write about them, contemporary architects. But I am completely open to have a conversation.
To talk to them. Anybody want to talk to Beatriz? Speaking of which, any conversations?
Yeah, so I just found the last couple of comments to be particularly illuminating in terms of your background with Tafuri, which you spoke about before, that your historical production is not, or the goal is not to put architects on a pedestal, it's not to instrumentalize history, right. It's to write specifically about the preconditions for the creation of architecture. But you seem, sort of maybe in contradiction to that, to be an advocate of someone like Le Corbusier, who instrumentalizes history for his own use. So I wonder about that distinction, and maybe it has to do with what Sylvia was talking about regarding the diffusion of authorship, but I'm just curious about that.
Right, I'm not so sure in which way you think Le Corbusier instrumentalized history. My particular study of Le Corbusier, which was done for my dissertation, it was very problematic at that time. It was almost anathema in the 80s to say that an architect as Le Corbusier will have anything to do with the media. To even name media next to architecture was considered like a, I don't know, radical, right? Or anathema, you could say. So in the meantime, of course, many things have happened. So the study was in no way to promote Le Corbusier, but many people understood it as completely undermining Le Corbusier. You have to see it in the context of what had been written, what were the texts that has more recently been kind of the canon of Le Corbusier. You think about Colin Rowe, etc., etc. So that it was not and it never is an attempt to elevate an architect into I don't know what. Le Corbusier didn't need me to be elevated. He was already the most well-known architect of the century. What he probably needed is that, to look at an aspect of his work that nobody had looked at it before and say, and understand the way in which Le Corbusier understood 20th century media and use it to basically bring architecture to the 20th century.
I meant more that you allow architects to instrumentalize history, you don't.
How will I allow Le Corbusier to instrumentalize history? Is that I don't understand? You understand it?
No, you mean contemporary architects instrumentalize the history she produces. Is that what you're saying?
How do they do that? How do they instrumentalize the history I write? I don't know any. Do I understand?
What I meant was more that you seem early on in this conversation, you seem to be saying that it's a shame that architects don't write their own histories anymore.
Oh yes, I mean, you know, not their own histories. I'm not talking about history. I mean, you cannot write your own history, of course not. I mean, maybe you can do it in retrospective. You can write your autobiography or something. Those things are normally full of bullshit. People rewrite their own stories, including. I mean, you know, it's very selective. It's very, you know. No, I was not talking about that. I was talking about the medium of writing as a way to kind of put down your ideas, no matter how inarticulate they may seem. We all seem very inarticulate. I consider myself completely inarticulate too. You have to see me when I am about to write something. I'm completely kind of, you know. And I always think I'm not going to make it. I always think, and I think that is what keeps me on my toes. That I always think in this one I'm going to fail, you know. And the moment that I am convinced I will not fail, probably is not good anymore, or is not. There is nothing there, right?
So but success is a problem.
To be afraid is a good thing.
But
one thing. First, sorry I didn't get to introduce you on behalf of SCI-Arc properly, Sylvia. So we'll do it now. First, thank you for doing this. It's a pleasure to have you doing the thing. And thank you both. Couple of things. One, I think we learned that nobody wants to be Ken Frampton. Not even Ken.
Not even Ken, for sure,
Frampton,
these days.
Which I think is an important conclusion today. No, but to stay on the subject of writing, because this is something that, and it's probably a half-cooked comment question, which is, because it's something that it always keeps going back to my head, because when you mentioned the New York on complexity and contradiction, on even the generation, I would say, of Greg, Alejandro, Jesse, Ben, those guys, they managed to write, and I would argue, they were mostly manifestos. They were more blueprints, strategies to take over the world somehow.
Exactly.
And for some reason, that was the last moment. I would say late 99, 2000 was the last time, because even those guys, the most recent production of work is much more focused on the practice or how much they accomplished that manifesto or not. And then the younger generation, myself and the youngers and so on, is not that we didn't feel the need of the manifesto, but that at least personally, I saw certain kind of obsolete notion of the notion of a manifesto. That the manifesto needed to be written, and we were talking earlier on with you, Beatriz, about the notion of the construction of the discourse, which I'm not 100% sure that the writing is absolutely necessary any longer for the construction of discourse. Or we are in the phase that we need to think in different methods about how we construct a discourse that is not relied on the notion of manifesto, but relies on something much more dynamic and fluid that need to change and be updated, not by the minute, but certainly much faster than, like, I don't know, something like Delirious New York survived 25 years. It's hard to imagine a book like that it will have that impact and that durability in the current cultural context than we are. I'm not arguing that this is better, I'm just saying it's a sign of time, that it's a kind of a compression of time that is completely different with the things that they take it completely away from the historical problem, because those things were manifestos posing to an extent to certain kind of historical critical books. But when you look at it, they're not. They were all in the desire to produce a certain level of originality. So again, that's one of the things of Half Cook. Do you think it's worth for us to speculate about the different construction of the discourse that doesn't rely on the notion of writing, and it will rely on something that is much more maybe collective and is much more plugged by pieces, that it will become almost like a
Plugged by what? What did you say?
plugged by individual contribution instead of a singular idea of a book and so on. There is something that became almost much more like a jungle or like ecological mechanism to understand the discourse. And if so, it's something that the schools and institutions, we should invest in time figuring out what is that model.
Yes, I agree entirely with you. And I precisely that you talk about manifestos. This is the class I'm going to teach about this this semester, precisely the history of manifesto. And of course, the moment you start looking at the manifestos and the fundamental role that manifestos has played in the 20th century, I came down to the same conclusion. Where did the manifesto go? What kind of new forms of discourse are emerging now today? And I think it will be definitely the case. I have repeated it also today several times, that I think will be a new form, that it will come in different kinds of media and it will be more collective. My own tentative of making my students to work collectively was also understanding that a new kind of form of operating is emerging, right? The same very PhD students that are always so obsessed, or they were so obsessed in the 90s, they didn't even let you see what they were working on. They would not tell their friends next what their dissertation was about. It was kind of like this. And now it's completely the opposite, right? Complete exchange, open source. You know, nobody thinks anymore that the ideas are
But it's interesting. This is why I was saying we've had the conversation 1,000 times about whether this is, you know, and I would say it's a little disingenuous on your part to say that it was easy to give up, right? I mean, I think that the number of times I'm saying it was useful. I'm just trying to acknowledge that giving up on that as a goal was not so easy. And I would also say that I think that Alejandro or Greg or whatever, what they were writing was not a manifesto. I mean, it was much closer to research. I mean, you know, manifesto is a certain literary form. It has brevity, it has a certain form of rhetoric. It's a very specific kind of document. Right. So that's already post-manifesto, although it's still writerly.
Yeah, even complexity and contradiction is post-manifesto. I mean, Higgins says a soft manifesto, he calls it, and
gentle,
of course, and Ren calls it a retroactive manifesto. I mean, actually, the last group to have a manifesto was the metabolist.
But maybe there are two different things that we're talking about here, which is one is the construction of discourse. How is it constructed? How is it disseminated, et cetera? And I guess my fundamental question to us, you know, to myself as much as to you, is are the discourse producing machines that we have now institutionalized in fact acting as a retardant to the recognition, not to the production of new forms of discourse, because that's going to happen, but whether or not we're contributing to a condition in which it makes it more difficult to recognize the emergence of the new forms. And I think that that's a question that's important to you and a question of responsibility to us. It's just it's a question. The second part of it, I think, though, that is slightly different, and that has to do with the relationship between the critic or the person who writes, or not the person, the function of writing as an author, let's say, and the function of the designer, et cetera. So Beatriz has been really talking about a certain kind of model in which those separate functions are joined in a notion of the single author, whether the author is a single architect or a firm. And now we're talking about that proliferating. And the models of the relationship between the critic function and the architect function has either been, we've had two, elevating or undermining. Right? I mean, I think that those are the two terms that you used. So then we have to think, could there be other choices? Because Frampton is the elevator, you know, the way up, and then I will not be so rude as to name the names of the downers, but they're there. So then maybe there's another kind of platform. I'm not quite sure how to identify it. Anyway, there were questions here.
Yes.
Question maybe going back to the conversation about scientific terminology. in architecture. So we are guilty for the labs and the research in architecture. There's certain terms that seem to be coming into, let's say, PhD programs, such as kind of curatorial projects, projects concerning terminology of the museum or of the exhibition. I'm curious if you can speak to that vocabulary and that culture now coming into the project that is a, let's say, that used to do only writing, now also does a kind of multimedia production. So.
Yeah, I mean, in
Us
part,
too.
yeah, yeah, I think we do too. I mean, I think it has become more complicated, as we were saying, right? So now, most of the time I find myself on the phone or writing letters for people that graduated from Princeton in the PhD program. And you won't believe it, because before it was, the schools were interested in, like, can this person teach 19th and 20th century or whatever, or 18th and 19th century, or things like that. And now, most of the time, the question they are asking is, what else can they do? I mean, that is a given, that you can teach 20th century architecture if you graduated on that field in a good school and you finish your thesis. It is understood that you can. But what the school wants to know is that person can put together an exhibition, can they put together a book, can they put together a conference? Because of course the schools themselves have changed and they don't necessarily need a person in history and theory that can only do that. Nobody needs that, that's boring. And so, in a way, I think another aspect of your
But isn't
question.
that scary at the same time? I mean, I think there are two pieces of that, because as I'm just listening to this, on the one hand, my head is going, this is, for the scholar, applied research. I mean, I think if you push that conversation, you would end up in a space where you're talking about more immediate forms of dissemination, reaching different kinds of audiences than the book. You would go there. But the other part of it is, oh my God, the service that the PhD has to provide in a school of architecture now includes not only knowing the fucking history of everything from A to B and having spent half their lives in the archive, but also that they have to administer the school, that they have to do admissions, that they have to do a website, that they have to do the school brochure, that they have to do an exhibition, that probably they also have to do accreditation, by the way, because accreditation is really the moment in which writing becomes applied design in the protocols of schools of architecture, et cetera. So it seems to me that you're, the question, pardon me?
Yes, these other second things normally are,
Well,
they
that's
are
because you have to
compensated.
go to law school and also get a contract. So enough with physics,
would
you
you
need
say-
law.
Right.
Would you say that the exhibition that the school mounts for the NAB is possibly more radical than we have thought it to be? I mean, I remember at Princeton when I was going through accreditation, and I think Paul Lewis was putting together the exhibition. That was his installation. That was a big project.
Yeah, it's a very important moment. Yeah, in one side, it could be what you say, the service has become expanded, is in an expanded field of, of expertise.
Of shit work.
Yes, and at the same time, many of those people, they haven't done necessarily for the school, but they have done it for their own purposes. I have students like Lydia Calipoliti that graduated, that then mounted this exhibition, Acre Redux, that went around, etc., etc. So they learn something that was very productive for their own purposes, and they put them in the map in a different way.
But the NAB exhibit, it's, for me, it really, once you say NAB exhibit and the exhibit in the same breath, right, it's not, I mean,
Yeah.
well, no, it's not ironic. This is exactly what I was asking before. The NAB exhibit, the exhibit as rendering. That's exactly that question. So if Beatriz says, well, in whenever it was, putting Corb and media in the same sentence was a form of radical transformation, calling the NAB thing an exhibition, an installation, it puts that in a terrain, in a field that is very troubling in some kinds of ways. And I guess what I'm trying to think through, does that mean that the NAB exhibit is more radical than we thought, or does that mean that everything else is less radical than we fantasize it might be? And that is where we're at today. I'm not really sure. I think you're right. I mean, maybe you've got 4 minutes left. Anybody have one more pressing, Dora?
Yeah. So a question that is oriented toward you as an educator. We are a school who does not have the PhD, as you've heard. We don't have a master's degree. We don't have a specific kind of degree in history and theory. We're PhD light, right? And we're PhD.
No, you're not PhD less, because there are a lot more PhDs in the room than there would have been 10 years ago. So.
Right. And I think that this kind of symptom, maybe I'm asking a symptom question, which is, given that our degrees are, quote, professional degrees in both undergraduate and at the graduate level, what is your belief in terms of the pedagogical role of teaching history and teaching theory? Do you do the pro forma of, history 1, 2? Do you couple that with the theory? And, therefore, or all the writing in one shot, so to speak, so you have like a little bit of it or a sampling? Or do you begin to, imagine a more open pedagogy of this practice in the expanded field, if you will, and at that point, how do you envision that feeding back into maybe a question that would differentiate the practice from the profession, which I don't think has necessarily been clearly yet differentiated? And when we talk about the role of the person who's the architect and the historian, I'm wondering about, and their contribution to discourse, I wonder about how we then cast those roles between the practitioner and the professional.
Okay, is that all for me? No, I mean, I'm not sure that the fact that there is no PhD here changes anything at all in relation to the way you teach history and theory. I think, it's clear that there are now more PhDs teaching in the school than many years ago, and that in a way it's already kind of informing the teaching of the school. What is the role of history and theory in a professional school? I suppose the obligation of the historian, theorist, or whatever we want to call it, is to make students think, right? It's the same, and to put what they are doing in the context of what has been done before and the problems of our time, right? So I suppose that the teaching in schools of architecture of history should always be, is always been, traditionally, I think, or at least I think in the way it works better, it's when they are informed from the present, right? So the kind of questions that you ask yourself of history are not always the same. You go back selectively to history because you are concerned with the present. That's typical of schools of architecture, and I think that's a good thing, So history becomes like this repository that we go back to, kind of to understand what actually are the problems that we are dealing with in our own, in the practice. I also don't think that that is very healthy for a school to separate what is happening in the studio from what is happening in history and theory. In the schools in which this works better, there is some sort of fluidity. There is kind of a conversation, between the people teaching design and the people teaching history and theory. They used to be the same people. This is amazing. This has changed radically. When I arrived in Princeton, everybody who was teaching history and theory was also teaching design. Tony Bittler was teaching a studio. Mark Wigley was teaching a studio. And then we're doing history and theory. When I arrived at Columbia, it was the same. Mary McLeod, of all people, was teaching a studio. Kenneth Frampton
wasn't teaching either
she was.
well.
But Kenneth Frampton was teaching a studio. Okay, you see, that's the problem.
I'm going to have to cut that out.
Yeah, they were teaching a studio, so things have become more specialized since the PhD program. So I think that's a problem, in the sense that there is not so much of an involvement on the part of history and theory in the world of design. I think it works better when the historians and theorists also participate in reviews, at least. They participate in the discussion of the school, so they don't become like two separate realms, right?
I suppose you could just say, Jorah, I think your question was specifically to Beatriz, but I'm going to answer it anyway in my just my prerogative here. Which is to say that I think that history theory in schools of architecture have the obligation to teach students how to think. But I don't think that that's their purview. I think design faculty have an obligation to teach their students to think, and I would like to think that they thinking architecture just as well as the history theory person does. So but I do think, and I think that Beatriz would say the same thing once said that way. No, there was a little implication that the history theory person teaches you how to think and the architect teaches you, I don't know, how to dance.
How to think as well. But I mean, in the design, you are in the context of the world of design. What the historian theory is making you think, in what context is your work being produced historically? And in the context of the discussion of our time as well, that is the more precise answer. I'm sorry if I will never say such a thing. Of course, the world of design is a world of thinking as well.
Clarifying, but I suppose you could take the issue of specialization. You could either think of an expanded pedagogical field and have a kind of collective cross-disciplinary model within the school. You could also proliferate expertise, which is to say, I think that, when you have technical studios and you have representational studios and you have structural studios, et cetera, you might also think about teaching writing in different forms. And I have no idea. You can ask some of the current UCLA students who are back there. A couple of years ago, I decided, I'm just going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to assign my own students to become skilled at making pecha kucha presentations, thinking of this as the kind of performative version of the tweet. And after a year or two, I was just so deeply horrified that I thought, if I never hear another pecha kucha, I'm going to be so happy. I couldn't do that. But instead, we hired a creative writer to teach writing as a writing craft, quite independent of content, which I think is maybe something that happens in the soft tech studios, for example. But that might potentially be another model, one that I think that we'll probably see in other places too, a proliferation of radically diverse expertise, as opposed to a kind of convention of joined expertise. I promised I would get you to get you where you need to go. So I think that with that, I will really encourage you to keep your eyes open for the Playboy show and to look at the books and clip stamp fold if you haven't already done that. These are really extraordinary bodies of work. For those of you who have a couple more hours to spend with Beatriz, get in your car and go over to the A&D Museum, because she's going to switch hats and present on Saarinen. More on the womb chair, I would imagine, and if you have time, go do that. And otherwise, thank you very much for engaging in the conversation. Thanks for coming.